Hello, everyone, and good morning to our listeners. One of the things that I am humbled by and thankful for is the support that this growing community gives me. So, thank you. And thank you for listening, for engaging, and for supporting our show. If you've subscribed and shared our show, thank you. And if you haven't, please do so. And I'll be forever grateful because it helps us to continue to expand our reach and our mission to improve the world of work. Now, we're approaching the end of our first season, and throughout every conversation, from navigating career changes to the creator economy to the science of numerology, one truth has become undeniable: that success, whether you define it by performance or profits, is dependent on aligning people with purpose. Today's guest is the living proof of that truth. Christy Pretzinger is the CEO and founder of WG Content, an industry-leading agency that transformed the landscape of healthcare content. But she didn't do it by grinding her people down. She built it by obsessively lifting them up. She's the pioneer of the Better Quotient culture and the author of the book, Your Cultural Balance Sheet. She argues that kindness is a strategic business driver and that culture should be measured with the same rigor as your financials. So as we prepare to wrap up the season, Christy's here to help us synthesize everything we've learned. We're going to talk about why soft skills are actually the hardest currency in business, how to rebuild broken trust in the modern workplace, and why you can't lead others until you know yourself. Christy, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Clarence. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Likewise, thank you. Now, Christy, I do want to start with the title of your book, Your Cultural Balance Sheet. In business, the balance sheet is really the holy grail of value: assets, liabilities, equity. So by pairing that hard financial term with the word cultural, you're making a very specific argument. Why do you believe that culture should be viewed with the same financial rigor as cash flow? And what happens to a company that looks at culture off the books?
Well, first of all, I think that the whole way that it came about, I'll share that backstory really quickly, is that I have a lot of friends who have had successful exits. So we were having dinner and having conversation about EBITDA and net income and all that kind of stuff. And I said, of course I look at my balance sheet every month, but it's almost like I look at my business through the lens of a cultural balance sheet. So it was
Mm,
kind of a one-off comment. And then one of my friends said, well,
yeah.
you got to write a book about that. So as I started writing the book, I started with a talk about it. And I was like, I don't even know if this analogy works. Like,
Mm.
I'm not sure if it makes sense or anything. But in the process of writing it, what I discovered, while it is definitely more esoteric and existential than certainly the numbers on a balance sheet, there are assets, liabilities, and cultural equity.
Mm,
But what I discovered in the writing of the book is that the cultural assets are many things, obviously, including people. There's all sorts of things. But the cultural liabilities, what I discovered is that if you focus, if you pay attention, you find those blind spots that are your liabilities, and then you have an intention to turn them into assets, and then you do the crucial thing of paying attention to
mm,
your intention, you can actually move liabilities into the asset column on your cultural balance sheet. I can give
mm,
you an example. For example, if you catch yourself as a leader or someone in an organization says, well, this is the way we've always done it, we have to keep doing it that way. That would be an indication of rigidity.
mm,
So you want to be more flexible as well as being consistent. So there's a fine line there. But if you know you want to be more flexible, you have the intention to develop flexibility, to catch yourself when you say that, and to be open to doing things a new way. By doing that, and then you make sure that you check yourself when someone says something to you that's different, that you don't say, nope, we can't do that. And then you move that into the asset column because you have developed flexibility, and now that's a cultural asset. And then when
mm,
it comes to cultural equity, in this formula. The cultural equity is the culture itself that you have built. That is what the equity is.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's powerful, but I do want to push back on that a little bit because the metaphor, of culture and the balance sheet, culture is inherently messy, right? It's very nuanced, it's human, and a balance sheet is rigid, it's binary, it's transactional, as you just shared. It's very black and white, whereas culture is not. Do you worry that by forcing culture into more of a financial framework, that we run the risk of diluting it as leaders? Is there a danger that we might unintentionally commoditize the very human connection we're trying to build by trying to measure it like cash flow?
Well, I honestly don't know a way of measuring it like cash flow. So when I use that analogy, I'm not talking about measuring it in that way. But the thing about a balance sheet, Clarence, that I always think about is that that is a moment in time. It's a snapshot. It's not the whole picture. It's just that moment. The
Right.
next day it can change depending on your accounts payable, your accounts receivable, all that kind of stuff. So it's actually a lot more fluid than we like to believe because we want a simple
Yeah.
solution to a complex problem. So
Yeah.
when it comes to our culture, everything doesn't have to be like, a lot of people say if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist.
Right.
Well, I think there's a lot of ways to measure culture. What's your turnover?
Mm.
A turnover is a hidden cost on a balance sheet. I, for example, have probably average employment, I think 7 to 8 years, and everybody on my leadership team has been with me for over 10 years. So these are people who've been around, they stay, they have a lot of intellectual property around knowledge, around the entire growth of the business, which contributes to that culture, to the shared identity that we have. But again, it's not measured in numbers.
Yeah, no, I think that's important. I think the shared identity is a very crucial piece for leaders to understand and really lean into as they go into a framework like treating culture or looking at culture as more of a balance sheet. Now, one of the things that you talk about a lot in your work is this topic of kindness. And I want to dive into this a little bit because I think it's such a topic that a lot of business leaders either hesitate or hide from or dance around. But you explicitly state in your work that you built your business based on kindness. And for a lot of those traditional leaders, kindness sounds like weakness. It sounds like avoiding tough conversations. How do you define kindness in a high performance business context? And how has it become for you and for WG Content a competitive moat?
Well, I think it's really important to note the difference between kindness and weakness. And kindness isn't just being nice either. You know, Many elements of kindness are measurable. Being clear in your expectations is
Mm,
kindness. Having
yes.
boundaries is kindness.
Mm,
Also, how you behave in the downtimes by being transparent and sharing information with people is also kindness. The thing for me that I see about kindness in our organization is the ability to recognize the whole person. That
mm,
you're not, don't just leave your emotions at the door or your virtual door in our case, but you bring all of that to the workplace. And all of us recognize that about one another. And we seek to be kind. It's one of our values. We are empowered, curious, kind, and fun. But
mm,
I had a podcast host ask me once, why was kindness my driver? Why did I say I wanted to build a business based on that? And then he said, did you work for unkind people?
mm,
And it was such a good question because I had never ever thought about that. And I
right.
said, when I thought about it, I said, I did not work for unkind people. However, the structures within which they worked did not foster kindness. And
Mm,
then that in that moment was almost like a little epiphany of like, oh, that's how our business structure has evolved over time. I say that
yeah.
we engineer the processes, the structure, the relationships to allow for the weaving of the tapestry, for the weaving of the soft skills that we apply to enhance the relationships we have with each other.
Well, I'm curious because, and this is something that I want to explore in the next season of the podcast. But so much has changed in the business landscape in the world of work over the last few decades, and you've created WG content 2 decades ago, 20 years
Yeah,
ago.
about
Is
two
that
decades
correct?
ago. Yeah, yeah.
And so you've gone through many seasons in terms of the changes of the world of work. And 20 years ago, kindness, to to the younger generations, we wouldn't even talk about kindness in the context of work, but you were already building a business 20 years ago on that premise. So what have you seen in terms of that, in terms of leading with kindness in the world of work? What have you seen changed over the last 20 years? And why is it that today, in this post-pandemic world, we can talk about kindness in terms of culture building, whereas 20 years ago it was taboo?
Yeah, I don't know if I even would have thought about it being taboo at the time, although I'm sure you're right. I know that when I was building this business, my goal was kindness and also to build a business where I wanted to work. And what that meant when I broke it down was that the people should not have to ask permission to live their lives, meaning
Mm,
doctor's appointment, kids, school activities, or whatever those things may be, that you don't have to ask permission to live your life, that you can bring your whole self to work, which wasn't a thing 20 years ago. I think what's happened now in my own experience of just observing all of this is, well, first of all, too, back then I'd done a lot of work on myself already by that point. Of course, I'd continued to do it. And that it's a process that, in my own experience, you can't get it wrong and you'll never get it done. So I'm a continuous work in process. But I knew that kindness is who I wanted to be as a human being, cut me
mm,
to my core. And I want to treat the person who sweeps up the same way I would talk to a CEO. And
yes.
that's always been very important to me, that authenticity. And you're probably too young to remember this, and I don't know about your audience, but I know that, like, for example, now with Gen Z, authenticity is important.
Yeah.
About 30 years ago, Oprah Winfrey still had a television show, and she talked about authenticity. But then she talked about it so much that I think it actually lost its meaning. That word did.
Mm,
So now Gen Z is bringing it back, and I'm very happy that they are. And I think what they have seen in my experience of the reading and the learning that I've done about it is that they have seen the lack of kindness with which their parents or the future generation ahead of them have been treated. So they're opting out of management, but not leadership. Management because they see people getting used and chewed up and spit out, but not leadership
mm,
because they want to connect. They want to lead people. They also are seeking community and and real connection. And the problem for Gen Z is that many of them don't have those skills because of COVID.
yeah.
They
Right.
grew up in some very critical years in isolation and
Right.
thinking that, online was real. And now
Right.
that's why Gen Z wants to go back to the workplace. You know, Gen X and millennials are like, I don't want to do that. And they're like,
Get us out.
we want to be around people. We want that community. So all of that, I mean, the whole thing about the kindness, is that I hope that we have evolved over time with that. I think that there's a lot more discussion around the human side of leadership.
Yes.
I still think there's a huge behavior gap there. I
Yeah.
think that the things that make us human are humanity. I mean, our emotions, our vulnerability, our curiosity, our empathy, all of those skills that somebody misnamed soft skills because they're hard skills because they require attention.
Right.
Those are becoming something that we talk about more.
Yes. Well, I think that's the key piece of it. And one of the things that I find really fascinating about having this platform and having the opportunity to talk to leaders like you is that it tackles this lazy overgeneralization that we've had for years about the generational uh, relationship between leading with kindness or not, where we assume that the older generations just are this rigid, very black and white, don't care about people way of leading, but yourself and a few other guests that I've had are proof that that's not true. But and that authenticity and leading with kindness have always existed, but the difference is that we're now more willing to have conversations about it. And I think, that's one of the things I want to do with this podcast is amplify those conversations. But even on the topic of authenticity, I'm glad you bring it up because throughout this whole season of the show, we've explored self awareness from many different angles. And the most common keyword that came up in every conversation, other than alignment, across all the generations that I've spoken to, was that word authenticity. And so we've established this season that you can't lead others until you lead yourself. And this is something that you do talk a lot about in your work. And you've even developed a concept to really operationalize this called the Better Quotient. And I'd love for you to introduce this to our listeners now, because I think it ties exactly to what we just talked about. So, what exactly is the BQ or the Better Quotient? How did you develop it? What gap in the traditional business world is it designed to fill?
Well, the way that the BQ evolved was really out of my own experience from, really childhood and well into adulthood of struggling with perfection, the idea of perfection, and
Hmm.
specifically with not being perfect. And many, many years of having that voice in my head. And finally, having an epiphany that I was never going to be perfect and I never could be perfect. But what I could be was better. So I could be a better teacher, I could be a better mother, I could be a better friend, and I didn't have to be perfect at any of those things. So I was like, "Oh, better, not perfect." And then I thought, "Okay, EQ, what about BQ?" So we know that our IQ, our intelligence quotient, is malleable when we're young and mostly settled by the time we're in adulthood. BQ is
Hmm.
more like EQ in that it grows through practice. And the way that I describe it is BQ is all about recognizing our emotions and emotional states, both our own and those of others. And BQ tells you how to behave as a result of that awareness, how to make a better choice to result in a better outcome that is in alignment with your own purpose.
Hmm. Now, do you find that a lot of the work that you're doing there related to the Better Quotient, does it tend to tie into this topic of imposter syndrome, that we are all victims of? Or does it become more of a framework to navigate imposter syndrome? And I ask because, I'm a perfectionist, and that's something that I've struggled with my entire life. And I've obviously done the work to, understand myself and really optimize and maximize my self awareness. And I've found, at least for me, that my imposter syndrome comes from my perfectionism. And Brene Brown talks a little bit about this as well, where she talks about perfectionism and how that relates to shame and how that relates to imposter syndrome. Does the Better Quotient tend to lead to conversations around that same space, or am I misreading that?
No, it very much does. It's really about understanding our capacity to become better. And to your point about perfectionism, perfectionism is a false premise that it's even desirable. But we are inundated with images and information about things that appear to be perfect, right? Whether they're real or not is not really relevant to our brains. We perceive them as real and aspirational. But the thing about perfectionism, Clarence, is that if we are striving for that, we actually just totally eliminate the possibility of really knowing ourselves.
Yeah.
Because if we are striving for perfection, then by definition, we cannot have the vulnerability to acknowledge that we aren't perfect and therefore pull those layers back and bring parts of ourselves to the light to be sifted and weighed. So you have to have imperfection. You have to have that in order to have the self-awareness and to evaluate your triggers, your patterns, your values. All of those are foundational to self-awareness, and none of them are accessible through perfection.
Yeah. Well, I think that's huge, because one of the things that, and it sounds like, the concept behind the Better Quotient is to really bring your whole selves to work,
Mhm.
which I think is really critical at this point in time, because I keep my ear to the ground. So I'm on social media a lot, because that's where a lot of people go to vent about their experiences. And what a lot of people talk about is this, obviously the concept of masking, but even this notion of not bringing your whole self to work, and basically having two identities of you at work and you outside of work. But moving into a world where it's this idea that we bring our whole selves to work, I think is transformative, and it's where we really need to move as a society to understand how to better navigate the world of work. And a previous guest of mine, Linda, she had talked about bringing 90% of yourself to work and leaving 10% outside of work to let it be kind of your letting the freak flags fly kind of thing.
Yeah.
But for the leaders that are listening, that transformative process, journey, step might sound daunting. So, by understanding themselves, does helping an employee become a better human actually make them a better employee? How do you practically invest in a team's BQ without crossing the line into becoming their therapist?
Well, so much in that question there. I have to like kind
Yeah.
of back up and think about all the things that
Yes.
you asked. Um, First of all, I think that if anyone generationally, automatically dismisses, like, Gen X dismissing Gen Z. I always jokingly say it's just like baby boomers dismissing millennials. I'm like, well, that just shows you're bad parents because these
Mm,
are your kids. So, like,
yes.
what's the
Yeah.
situation? And by the way, those boomers were the people at Woodstock when the greatest generation was looking at them like, what are you doing putting flowers in the stocks of guns?
Uh,
So that's always been a struggle between the generations, and that just continues to happen. But I think I've never been that way. The business that I built was based on. I am not a millennial, but it was based on millennials. It was like flexible. It was virtual. It was allowing people to get their work done on their own time. All things that appealed to millennials. And the same
mm,
thing with the Better Leader Project, of which Better Quotient is an integral part. That is designed for Gen Z, and it's to acknowledge where they are and the leadership path that they have ahead of them. Um, I think that authenticity, to your point, someone saying bringing 90% of themselves to work. I think that when it comes to vulnerability, and that is a big part of authenticity, that you really need to have your spidey sense, right? Depending on the
yes.
organization where you work. If you're in a very large organization and maybe you have a team that is coworkers and maybe a couple direct reports, you might be able to be vulnerable out and down in that organization, but you have to discern how safe it is to be vulnerable up. So there's another thing Brene Brown talks about is like, not everybody earns your secrets. So when it comes to being vulnerable, it doesn't mean that you open your kimono. You might acknowledge that. I mean, one of the things I always acknowledge with my team, and I'm acknowledge with you right here, I talk about this stuff all the time. And yet I'm very aware that I am deeply human and deeply flawed. And
Yes.
I am like, Seneca said, I'm like in the same ward as you are, examining our illnesses together, and
Mm,
striving to be better, not perfect. But I'm
yes.
certainly a work in progress and continue to be.
Yeah, well, I think something that comes to mind with what you just said is this notion of authenticity versus genuineness, and this was something that I started to explore as a result of the conversations that I've been having with people this season. Is that there is a difference. That authenticity is about your inner self. It's about understanding, your values, your character. It's very internal. Whereas genuineness is about your outward expression. It's about how you communicate, how you behave based on that inner authenticity. And this is something that I started to explore because part of the thing that part of my philosophy is about learning how to blend and learning how to connect your inner world, your inner, being with how you communicate that outside and how to do that effectively in a way that is aligned. And I think that's the one of the biggest misunderstandings that people have, and it affects the way that they approach this notion of authenticity because they're not realizing that there is a big difference between navigating that with yourself first before you navigate the outward expression of that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I never would have thought about it that way, Clarence, about, being genuine versus authentic are two different things. But I can see your point. I've never really parsed those two words that way. But something you just said that made me think of something I learned many years ago is I had a coach teach me, you don't have to say every thought that you have. You can put it into a thought book. And that
Right.
was a learning for me. And that was something about bringing my authenticity, but being genuine, but not saying, again, not being vulnerable and saying everything that occurs to me, or,
Right.
not responding quickly. Then instead I pause and notice, and then I, anchor in my why, and then I choose an appropriate action. But the genuineness, I suppose, in your story would show up as the action. What's the action that I'm taking, as opposed to the other two steps of pause and notice and anchor in your why? I mean, that might
Right.
be actually a way of
Yes.
distinguishing those.
Yes, 100%. So I want to pivot a little bit because one of the things that really drew me to you and your work is your passion for building environments where people can thrive. This is, as you and I know, critically needed in today's world. Yet so many organizations are still so unwilling to address it, let alone to tackle it head on. But as you and I also both know, the environment is really only one half of the equation. The people are the other half. So to see genuine thriving, the people and the environment have to align. So if a company has a stated value of innovation, for example, which is the environment that they want, but then their cultural reality is a culture of fear, and that's the environment that they have, then there's a massive liability. In your 20 years of leading, how do you detect those what I call micro misalignments before they become toxic, before they lead to the toxic work cultures that we see today? What's the canary in the coal mine, so to speak, that tells you that your cultural balance is moving into the red?
Well, I think, for me, I own a business, so I'm the ultimate decision maker. And I say in my organization that I cast the vision for the culture, but it is the employees who live it out every day. That is the environment that they create. And
Yes.
that is the culture. Um, I don't think that for me that there's a big difference there in terms of gauging it. It's again kind of the distinction between authenticity and genuineness. It's a distinction without a difference, sort of. And I think the same is true for like the culture leading with kindness and with your humanity, with
Mm,
the
yes.
common experience we have, which is emotional, by the way.
Mhm.
The common language of emotions that we all have is kind of the level playing field. Now,
Yeah.
we obviously need to moderate those emotions and not just, run wild with things, but recognizing that we are feeling beings first, not thinking beings, is the starting point for so much of the self awareness, which then in turn leads to better leadership and also being a better employee.
Yes. So I think that a lot of that comes back to this topic of vulnerability that you've brought on or you brought up a couple of times in this conversation. And it really leads us to this massive problem in the industry, right? Companies spend billions of dollars every year on leadership development, usually in the form of boring slide decks, passive videos, or one day workshops that everyone forgets by Monday morning. And I will say, you and I are probably, some of the facilitators for those workshops, though probably not boring. Um, but we have what I call a leadership industrial complex, yet we still have a crisis of leadership. You launched the Better Leader Project to directly challenge that old model. You've argued that lasting change doesn't come from a curriculum, but from, and I quote, conversation, connection, and community. And crucially, your core promise is that before you can lead others, you must first know yourself. So, my question to you is why is that foundational step of knowing your patterns, your triggers, your values so often skipped in a traditional corporate setting? How does shifting that focus from learning tactics to building self awareness fundamentally transform the way that a leader shows up for their team?
I think that a lot of this goes back to very old school thinking. It's the whole like GE way
Very, yeah.
that whatever his name was, led. I can't even think of his name right now. But that is
Jack
not,
Welch?
yeah,
Is
Jack
Jack
Welch.
Welch?
Thank you,
Yeah.
Jack Welch. That is not what people want. And it's not the way people want to live their lives. But things take a long time to change. And especially in my experience of working with, not owning one, but working with larger organizations, that can be really challenging. People are ingrained in that. And also there's different generations that have moved into leadership that maybe don't know that, aren't familiar with that, don't want to know that. Personally, I think that the reason people don't want to access their humanity, their emotions, all of those things that make us who we are is because it's hard. And also it's scary. I think
Yes.
that when we first embark on a journey of self-exploration towards self-awareness, it's a little scary at first, especially if you have any tendency towards perfectionism because you think, "Oh, no, I'm gonna find something really icky there, and I don't even wanna look at it." But when you
Mm,
start bringing things out, you realize, "Oh, okay, maybe that's something worth letting go of, or maybe that's something I can shine up a little bit, and it's really not a bad thing."
yeah.
But it's, in my own experience, it was very, very, very scary to begin the work of self-awareness, and yet it's ongoing, and it's also the best work that I've ever done because as I think it was I can't remember who I used to think it was Goethe, but it's not him, might be Whitman, said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And
Mm,
to me, that your life starts with your own experience of the world. And you experience the world not through your actions, but through your emotions. All of the stimulus that we receive through our five senses hits our limbic brain, which is our emotional brain, long before it hits our rational brain. So we are emotional beings first. And acknowledging that and celebrating that and then regulating that is really the first step in the journey of self-awareness and authenticity.
yeah. Well, so I think that how we approach that has shifted a lot, but has been influenced significantly by the pandemic, right? And so I'm kind of curious, what you've learned from your experience building cultures of kindness, of vulnerability, of trust before the pandemic, and how that has changed things for you, or how has that changed how you've approached it after the pandemic?
For us, because we've always been virtual, I mean, I intentionally built this business virtually because I didn't want to have an office because I didn't want to have to go there. So that was 20 years ago. A lot of people really weren't doing that thing yet. And so the fact that we had done that, so by the time 2020 came around, we were already well equipped with all sorts of tools to allow us to function virtually. And in fact, we were able to help a lot of our clients transition to that because we knew how to do it. So that wasn't the big difference for us. I would say that really being able to find tools and again, engineer the structure of teams to encourage and allow for that kind of openness. One of the things that I'm a big believer that your values should be something that you can quote. You should be able to say it. And
Yeah.
we are empowered, curious, kind, and fun. And they are in that order because they kind of roll off your tongue.
Mhm.
And the values that you have should remain consistent, but the expression of those values might change.
Mm.
As ours was empowered, we think like owners. It still is that, but we've toyed with that a little bit because the bigger we get, the harder it is to expect everyone to think like owners. They
Right.
don't want to think like owners. That's not their goal. So you fine tune that a little bit. But the thing that I firmly believe about values is that they should be a constant thread that flows throughout your organization and upon which every decision can be made.
Mm.
And then in that way, you are constant use that thread to keep everyone aligned.
Well, and on the topic of core values, I think that so much of it, I mean, I talk about this all the time in terms of, the difference between values and virtues. And, a lot of organizations, they plaster the values on the wall, or they talk about it, it's in their handbook, but it doesn't actually get lived. And I think we need to move to a world where we move from the concept of core values and transition into this world of living core virtues, where we actually hit it head on and talk about how we translate the values into actions. And I think that's the missing piece in many organizations, where we don't have those conversations with the leadership team, but even beyond that, with the rest of the organization of, yes, these are the things that are important to us. How do we live it? What do we do?
Boy, I tell you, you're going deep there, expecting people to take like, personal virtue. That's like starting to make it really even softer for people. I love the idea. I don't know how. I mean, I think that even just starting with values and vulnerability is enough for people who are a little like, I don't know, there. Watch out,
Yeah.
stay over there with that stuff. But
Uh-huh.
I don't think you're wrong in that. The values have to be translated into action. For me and our organization, we crowdsourced those probably 12, 13 years ago and have
Hmm.
not ever changed them. Now, I've run into other small business owners who are like, oh, yeah, I'm rewriting our values all by themselves in a room. I'm like, so where are the people here? How are you going to get the buy in? And why are you changing your values?
Hmm.
Your values are a core. It's who the organization wants to be at its core. Again, the expression of it may change, but I think your idea of virtue as the action of values makes a lot of sense. I've never thought about it that way, but I do think it makes a lot of sense. I also think that word virtue might be a hard sell in corporate America,
Absolutely.
yeah. But
Yeah.
well, I wanted to address too what you talked about, training, the leadership development, and 100% I agree with you that the workshops, 1 or 2 day workshops, change behavior for maybe a week tops, and then we are going to just float right back to our level set with behavior we're comfortable with. And the online model is frequently abandoned
Mm,
because it doesn't really imprint. So that was in the actually the whole birth of the Better Leader Project was saying these things aren't working. What can we do that actually affects meaningful change? And what I've learned through my own experience, through a beta test of doing this, is that the way that we affect meaningful change is we create communities where we can practice the skills of self awareness in
mm,
community. We can practice empathy. We can practice being empathetic. We can practice vulnerability, and we can practice being being open with other people. And then, most importantly, is how do we feel that? We can listen to Brene Brown talk about vulnerability till the cows come home. Until you practice it and then
right.
also allow someone else to practice it with you, you don't know what it feels like. And you
Yeah.
don't know that it's actually a superpower. But
Right.
once you've practiced it in community and you have a period of time, it's not a 2 day workshop. This is a commitment. Then you realize that, oh, these are really good skills. I see how they've helped me in this short amount of time. I wonder how I could express that with my team or with my boss or even with your family. Because personally, I don't think that there is a work self and a non work self. I mean,
Right.
we are people all the way through. And if you are different in those places, then there's probably a bit of a mask that
Yes.
you are putting on. And some parts of that are absolutely required depending on the organization in which you work, but not all of it.
Yeah, well, I think the key word there is practice, and in your work, you also talk a lot about trust, right? You talk about kindness, you talk about vulnerability, you talk about self awareness, you talk about trust, and I think when it comes to trust, practice is an important foundation to that, and it's all obviously rooted in self awareness and understanding yourself first as a leader and what that means in the context of the organization, but self awareness is hard. Self-awareness is hard to achieve as people. And how do we even measure that, right? Like, and I talk about this, I think I talked about this with a previous guest, but we also have, we have different personality assessments that help us, but even those are subjective. Those are all based on our responses to the questions based on how we understand ourselves. So in a lot of ways, it's kind of flawed, but we know, and there's no doubt that self-awareness is critical. When it comes to trust, I would say that, and I think this is pretty evident with what we're seeing out in the world, trust is more broken now than ever when it comes to the relationship between employees and employers. And for decades, people poured their heart and soul into organizations that claimed to have a family culture only to discard them as soon as their needs changed. They spent years contributing just to be treated as a disposable asset. And the pandemic brought so much of that into perspective and really put it under a microscope. And millions of people have decided that they don't want to tolerate it. They don't want to participate in it anymore. And yes, I will say that when I say that, whenever I talk about that, there might be some level of overgeneralization, but there's no doubt that people are tired. They're done with the traditional way of doing things. And I shouldn't say people in general because there are people who still thrive in that corporate setting, but I think for a lot of people, the change is demanded because they no longer trust their leaders, they no longer trust their team, they no longer trust the system. So if trust is important in creating the environments where people thrive, but that trust no longer exists, and my question to you, and this might be deep, how do we move forward? How do we balance the ledger to move from where we are now to the next 5 years, 10 years in the world of work?
Well, if you are working with a team of people, if you have teams that report to you, or you work in an organization where there is a lack of trust, it's a very long game trying to build it. That's what I talk a lot about, is that trust is a long game. It's continued consistent behavior over time. It's conscious integrity in line with your values day after day, hour after hour, moment after moment. It requires attention. The problem is that it can be blown really, really quickly. I had an experience that I talk about, where I have a wonderful leadership team. As I said, they've all been with me minimum of 10 years. And there was an unpleasant conversation we were having about something. And this person brought up something, and I shut her down in that team meeting. And I share, like, there's so much wrong with doing that. I mean, so much wrong with it. I'm
Yeah.
a believer in many counselors make for wise decisions. And in that moment, shutting her down, I shut down everybody else too. That's a very dangerous thing for a leader to do. But probably the biggest thing, the potential that could have come out of that, is the hard won trust that exists between me and that person, and me and the whole team. That's where the self-awareness comes in. That's where the vulnerability comes in, where I'm able to say the next day, talk to the person and said, boy, I apologize. I was wrong. My reaction was wrong. I'm able to tell the whole leadership team that was not appropriate. And I'm willing to be vulnerable about that. And that can allow the trust to continue. But, I think that a lot of the big quit that we saw during and after the pandemic, really mostly during, was a function of bad culture. People acted like it was like, oh, life is ending too short. I'm going to get another job. No, it was like, I am tired of being
Right.
your whipping post, and
Hmm.
I'm going to go find some place that appreciates me. And I think that that really shook things up. I think my son always says, he's like, nobody will do it, but he thinks that there should be a government research study on the long-term ramifications of COVID, societally,
Mm-hmm.
in the workplace, in our government, in our culture at large. I mean, it's just been devastating. And, just because of who we are as people, we can't live there. So we march along. And I was just in Paris not long ago on a metro, and we're all like this close to each other. And I'm like, boy, we just never did have a pandemic, did we? We just got to
Right.
forget
Right.
about it, you know? And as a result, I think that we, again, like we just said with training, we slip back to our old set point. And
Yes.
it's very easy, especially in the workplace, especially if there's a pre-existing culture that is more GE Jack Welchish, that it's
Mm.
hard to affect that change.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that story. I mean, I think to your point, it seems to me that this is where authenticity and alignment really become the only currency that matters in terms of moving things forward in a place that is more, or in an environment that is more apt to build cultures where kindness, vulnerability, trust are at the center. But you can't rebuild that broken trust with a policy or a perk. How do leaders that might be listening, how do those leaders demonstrate through aligned action, not just words, that they are authentic enough to be trusted again? So if they were in a situation like what you just shared, where maybe they shut down or something else happened where they might have broken that trust, how do they demonstrate that they can rebuild that trust again?
This is where I really talk about, how do you access your own BQ, which is your capacity to become better. And it actually demands vulnerability with yourself, a willingness to look at the mistakes that you've made. That is hard to do. It's embarrassing.
Yeah.
And, for some of us, it's rather than just embarrassment, it becomes shame. That, like, I'm not perfect. I did this badly. And it just, so instead of acknowledging it, we just move on. La, 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 that didn't happen. And that's how the trust is completely broken. But
Mhm.
in that, if that's the case of who you are, chances are probably good that you have not built trust anyway. Because in order to build trust, there has to be a level, not, not everybody knows everybody's secrets, but there has to be a level of openness between people, a willingness to share yourself and your own shortcomings and your own aspirations of continuing to, you know, explore yourself and your values and your patterns and your triggers, right? And
Mm,
acknowledging your own imperfection, that you're, deeply human and deeply flawed. And therefore that gives other people, people you lead, people you work with, the capability, the comfort with doing the same with you. If you're a little
mm.
bit vulnerable with somebody, they like you more because you're
Right.
not putting
Yes.
on this mask. They're like, oh, like Brene Brown says, I thought it was just me. It's not just me. Like, oh my gosh, I've done that before too. And there's the commonality of our humanity.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that perfectly sums up or relates back to, your whole philosophy, which is that in order to lead others, you have to first lead yourself and understand yourself, which I think is the hardest lesson to get through in terms of leadership, right? When you look at the leadership curriculum, so to speak, self-awareness is something that, leaders talk a lot about, but I would say that it's the hardest one to really get through because it's a constant process. There is no end point, but if you don't even take the effort or put in the work to get started in understanding yourself and really building that self-awareness, there's no way that you can effectively lead others, at least from my perspective.
Oh, I agree. I mean, I think you can lead others. Whether you do it well is a whole different story.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
I think that the biggest thing about BQ, about being better, not perfect, about leading people with authenticity is really that willingness, which is very scary, but the willingness of looking at yourself. And
Mhm.
I think that's probably the biggest barrier to
Hurdle,
even
yeah.
starting the process, is because people, it's, we all grew up with all sorts of things. I always say nobody gets into adulthood without bruises. Nobody.
Hmm. Yes.
And what we want to do is focus on, like I always taught my son, everybody has bruises, but we don't kick each other in our bruises. You will recognize those in other people. Don't kick them there. And
Yeah.
also don't kick yourself there.
Hmm.
That is something that I think we all learn to work on, because for whatever reason, we have that voice in our head and it's not nice. It's a voice that says terrible things to us that we would never say to a friend
Mhm.
or ever probably even
Right.
speak out loud. So if we can learn
Mm.
to catch that and be like, thank you for sharing, move on, and recognize that that's not the truth. That back to the whole perfection thing. If we are striving for perfection, instead of looking at ourselves through rose-colored glasses, it's like we're looking at ourselves through foggy gray lenses. We're looking at a distorted image instead of really seeing the true self that we are, who is wonderful with all of our foibles and faults and acknowledgement of our humanity.
Mm. Wow. That was beautiful. That was powerful. Chrissy, as we wrap up this season, we've talked to change makers, we've talked to creators, we've talked to strategists. They all agree that the old way of working is broken. If a leader listening right now wanted to do an audit of their cultural balance sheet today, what are the first three assets and liabilities they should look for?
Well, the first thing is, depending on your area of responsibility when it comes to the balance sheet, is looking at your turnover. I mean, that's a pretty easy way, and being willing to look at that turnover as a reflection of your leadership. Again, requires a vulnerability to do that. I think that would be a big one. I think also looking, and it's hard to really measure it, but it as a leader. What's the level of engagement on your
Mm,
team? Are people engaged, and are they committed to the success of the organization or of the team itself? Are they enthusiastic about that? Do you have employees who have deep knowledge? Like, speaking of a T, they have deep knowledge in their area, but great curiosity about the other areas that maybe are just ancillary to them. Those are all
mm,
part of a thriving culture where people feel that freedom to be able to do those things. Those would be things that I would look at first. Of course, like I said, turnover is the biggest one. And then again, it has to start from within. You have to be willing. If you look and you see that you've got a lot of turnover on your team, it's incredibly vulnerable and painful to do, but you need to look at yourself and say, what's my role in that?
mm,
Where does my responsibility lie here? And some of it might not be with you. If you work in a large organization that is extremely dysfunctional and you have absolutely no influence over the culture. But I still would even push back on that and say that even in a large organization that has a toxic culture, if you are in any way responsible for any number of people in a team, then you can set the culture for that team. Whether it's just a couple people or, more, you can be responsible for that in setting the tone and working with those people and establishing all the processes and, the things that allow them to be their whole selves at work, even within something toxic.
Yeah, well, I think that's huge because culture is so directly tied to employee engagement. And I will say that engagement is a theme that we're exploring for the next season of the show. So I may have to bring you back to talk about
Come
just
on.
engagement in general.
Yeah.
But I'm a marketer. So as a marketer, I do a lot of research into what are people looking at, what are people searching for, and in the realm of employee engagement, the first three highest searches are the first one is like, what is employee engagement? And the second one is, how do you approach employee engagement as a manager, as a leader? And then the third one is employee engagement activity ideas. And so I think it's a huge problem that we see. I mean, Gallup has their research that, they revealed only 21% of the global workforce is actively engaged. So it's such a critical problem that we face in the world of work, but managers and leaders don't know how to approach it. But it's so directly tied to culture, but it's so gray that it's hard for people to know where to even start if they haven't done the work of understanding what even their role is as an individual contributor, like in the world of work or in the realm of culture in the
Yeah.
workplace, if that makes sense. And so I think if you don't know how you play a part in the culture, you couldn't effectively even talk about or
No,
influence how to build a culture.
of course not. And that does require that self-awareness. But I think also one of the things that I say when it comes to developing your own self-awareness, that you have to have an intention to do
Yes.
so. And then
Right.
you have to pay attention to the
Yes.
intention, right? Because,
Mm.
New Year's resolutions, right? I don't do them because I'm setting myself up for failure, but the average resolution lasts 4 months. That's not very
Mm.
long. And the
I think it's much shorter now.
well, it probably is because we have the attention span of gnats given
Right.
everything we do. So the attention that we pay to the intention that we have to build a culture, to actively build trust, to demonstrate leading with vulnerability, to demonstrate openly your own humanity. You have to have that intention. But again, without the attention that you pay to it, in whatever way
Mm.
you help yourself remind yourself to do that, without the attention, that intention goes by the wayside and nothing will change.
Yes. Mm. That's incredible. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's brilliant. A few last questions before we finish up here. But you talk about building environments where people can thrive. That is the core of what you are passionate about. If you could implant one belief into the mind of every CEO in America about the relationship between human thriving and the bottom line profit, what would it be?
Gosh, one thing that I would say that this is kind of a longer answer, but I will say that one of the things that I see as particularly painful in the American workplace is somehow we have decided that the only thing good is profit. And it's actually categorically false. I mean, if you
Yes.
look at the level of engagement, you look at the level of happiness, you look at all the different things, it's exactly the opposite. And in
Yeah.
fact, I saw this, someone asked chat or something and was very explicit about if you were going to tear down the whole environment, culture, business, government of a place and
Hmm.
rebuild it, what would you do? I was like, well, you would build an environment that focuses on um, wellness, health, and community. And the guy was like, yeah, well, people want profit. I said, no, people have done that. It's Finland, I think it's Norway, and it's New Zealand. And profit does not figure
Hmm.
into their matrix of how success looks. Now, I will tell you, if I were more like some leaders I won't name, who are probably the wealthiest people on the planet, who also have explicitly stated that empathy has been the downfall of Western civilization. If I were more like that, I wouldn't be willing to look at these things. I could also make a lot more money.
Hmm.
I don't want to do that. That is not what brings, to your point, alignment, engagement, joy to my
Yeah.
life. You know, one of
Fulfillment.
the best compliments I've ever received was one of my employees saying, "You know, I've never worked anywhere before that made me a better person until I joined
Mm.
this company." And I'm like, "Well, that's the goal. You know, I
Yeah.
want you to have a rounder, fuller, more authentic life and bring that not only to the workplace, but to every area of your life."
Yeah, well, I think that's huge, and that brings me really to what the intent is behind not just this podcast, but my philosophy and my consulting practice, which is that in order for us to achieve this sense of fulfillment that we're all after, we first have to start with alignment, and that messy middle is where the engagement happens, and really that's where the name of the show came from. It has been my philosophy, as a leader through the last 20 years that I've had the pleasure of leading people. And what you just said, I think, so perfectly summarizes what has to happen in that journey to finding fulfillment, to finding joy in what you're doing. But it has to start not just with the self-awareness, but with the willingness, as you said, to discover yourself, to put in the work, to gain that self-awareness and optimize it, or wherever you are in that journey.
Yeah, I think
um
management, leadership, you know, not really synonymous, but some people use them that way,
yeah.
is really some of the highest calling. If you
Yes.
realize that you have the privilege, as you said, the privilege of feeding into the lives of the people you lead, that
Yeah.
is massive. These
Massive.
are lives. You know,
Hmm.
you actually have an impact on the life of that person, and I always say, and that means the cascading effect on their family. You know,
Yes.
my hope is that the children of the employees of WG see how they happen to be all women employees, how their mother is treated, and that
Mm.
they will have higher expectations for the workplace because of that, because they know
Yes.
they don't have to be a cog in the wheel and that their humanity factors into their workday.
Mm. Well, one final question for you, Christy, as we end this episode. We're 2 episodes away from the end of this season, and my final episode will be, me focusing on that framework that I just shared of going from aligned to engaged to fulfilled in our careers, in our businesses. Based on your incredible journey, do you believe that it's possible for an employee to be truly engaged or fulfilled if the organization that they work for hasn't first done the work to be aligned with human values like kindness and trust?
Boy, that's kind of a loaded question there, Clarence, because I think that, you know, I think we all probably, hopefully, know people who are happy regardless of circumstance, right? They just are. And
Yeah.
boy, I wish I could be that person because I think it's a lot simpler and it's a wonderful way to be. You know, I think
Hmm.
that probably in my younger years I've looked at that a little bit of side eye like, well, they're just stupid. That's not true. You
Yeah.
know, happiness is a choice. So I think that you can be in a toxic environment and still insulate yourself enough that you can make your own work meaningful. And really, the way that I think we do that is through our interactions with other people. So
Yeah.
through our human interactions, through our community, that we are hardwired to connect into community, that you can still be engaged even in a toxic workplace.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, Christy, I think that you have so many insights, so many things that I want to just continue to pull the thread on and learn more from your incredible experience. And I always do this because I always end up having 90-minute episodes instead of the hour that I aim for. And I think so much of culture needs to be understood in terms of how it relates to engagement. Because again, I think it's one of the most critical problems that we need to address in the world of work. And there's a lot of studies that talk about employee engagement, but there's not a lot of studies or anything that talks about the solution. Or I think there's attempts at solutions, but not anything that is bold enough. And I think it all starts with the conversations and leaders being willing to ask hard questions, to talk about the soft things like we were talking about today. And I think until we have those conversations, we won't really solve the engagement problem. So, I may invite you back. I will
I
likely
would love
invite
to
you
come
back
back.
to
I think
talk about culture as it relates to engagement, because I think that can be a full season in and of itself.
well, yeah, and, even just in this conversation, Clarence, it's made me think, we had to go through layoffs back in June. First time in
Hmm,
my career that I've ever had to do that, and first time in 20 years of this
not easy.
organization,
Yeah.
and it was devastating, especially for
Hmm.
someone for whom culture is my reason for being and having to pull those threads of the tapestry apart. And just even this conversation, I'm thinking, gosh, we are not so big. We're 25 people. We're not so big that I shouldn't be able to reach out to people and get a pulse on how they're
Mm,
feeling, because I know that that was really hard. I know that it's scary. I know that the world is people are trying to get their footing in shifting sand right now,
yes.
and it's a scary place. And so even through this conversation, I appreciate you kind of it's brought it to top of mind. I'm thinking, okay, this before Thursday, I'm going to reach out to as many people as I can and just,
Love that.
do a pulse check and let them know that I'm thinking about them.
Thanks. I love that. Well, I think that even in preparing for this episode, it made me think. It raised questions that I want to explore in terms of, one of the questions that came up as I was preparing is leadership essentially about culture building? And that's something that I want to explore because, we understand that leadership is about understanding other or guiding others as much as ourselves. And we know that, you know, guiding others, leading others is about the culture that becomes the outcome. So, in essence, do we need to teach leadership not as being in service of others, but also as having that end goal, that end outcome of culture, if that makes sense? Like treating culture as the prime product or outcome of leadership.
Absolutely. And again, in that's it's quite aspirational for American businesses because right now, especially because the tone is set frequently by shareholder organizations who focus on shareholder value. We've seen a lot of this, a lot of
Mm,
behavior from um, the very, the seven tech businesses that own 40% of the S&P, and all of the frankly disturbing actions that they have been taking, all allegedly in interest of shareholder value. I think what is really an interest of lining their own pockets. And
yeah,
if we keep looking at that as our aspiration, that the more money you have, the better you are, then it's never going to change. It
right.
just won't. And
Yes.
again, for me, that is an anathema. That is not who I am. It's not the most important thing to me. It is important, of course. I've not had money and I've had money and I'll take it anytime, but not at the expense of other people. That
Yeah.
that would whittle it away too fast.
Yeah. 100%. Well, Christy, it has been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. And I think on behalf of everybody listening, and maybe even people who aren't listening, I want to say thank you for being proof that leading with kindness and leading with authenticity and caring about people is not a generational thing.
Yeah,
That there are leaders across all generations who are capable and who are committed and passionate about building cultural environments where people can absolutely thrive, where people can be human, where people can bring their whole selves and not have to worry about the consequences of it. So, on behalf of people, I want to say thank you because I think we need more leaders like you in the world.
I appreciate you giving me a platform to talk about it because, Clarence, I think there are a fair amount of people like me, but I don't think they have a platform, and we're not the ones
Mm,
who are lauded,
mm,
because maybe we don't have shareholders and maybe
yes.
profit
Yeah.
isn't our only motive. So, we aren't on CNBC, but we get
Right.
to be on platforms like this, and I very much appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. I want to spread your message as much as I can. But if people want to work with you, if people want to work with WG content, if people want to connect with you to learn more about your insights and experience, what's the best way for them to do so?
They can go to christypretzinger.com and there's get in touch there. They can find me on LinkedIn. Very easy, Christy Pretzinger, and also at wgcontent.com. All of my contact information is in all three places.
Perfect. And if they're interested in learning more about the Better Leader Project, is that the best way for them to learn about
I
it
would
as
say
well?
that one would be probably either through LinkedIn or through christypretzinger.com. At that website, there is a link to the Better Leader Project, and there is a place to join the movement and get more information.
Perfect. And we'll make sure to include all those links down in the show notes. So make sure to check those out. Christy, I want to say one last time, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your insights. You have so much brilliance that we have not even been able to touch yet. So I look forward to having you back for another episode to pull more from your experience. But thank you for taking the time to share that with us and our listeners today.
Thank you so much for having me, Clarence, and I would love to come back. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation.